Usul, Upsuladagwe. Uh, Hello, welcome. My name is Neil Silcox. I'm so excited to be welcoming you today to EDID in Teaching and Learning. I'm speaking to you today from Chibuktuk, Halifax, which is in Mi'kma'ki. And I'm sure people are joining us from all over the place. So if you have the inclination, please let us know in the chat where you might be coming to us from. Halifax, Mi'kma'ki, is under the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which I think is beautiful. Something I didn't really know about until I moved to this part of the world. And I'm really inspired by a lot of talk I've been part of, not only about the rights to peace and friendship, but the responsibilities of peace and friendship. And I think that Dr. Toni Roberts embodies that terrifically in everything I've done with them. Toni wears a lot of hats. Toni is the educational technology consultant at Mount Allison. Toni is the Priddy Crawford Professor of Teaching and Learning at Mount Allison, is also the Jaroslawski Visiting Scholar at Bishop's University. They teach sociology and psychology at Mount Allison and Acadia Universities. They're also the co-chair of the Maple Leaf Teaching and Learning Center, and as such, sort of my boss a little bit. So let's make this a really terrific session. I'm so excited to hear from their wonderful wisdom. So thank you very much. And Toni, I'll give it to you to take it away.
Thanks, Neil. And I am a terrible boss, so watch out. Just kidding. So hi, everyone. So I'm not sure if expertise is quite the right language to use, but thank you very much, Neil, for that introduction. So some of you know me, some of you don't. Neil gave you a little bit of introduction. I do have a kind of a strange and unusual educational background, which includes degrees in chemistry and women's studies and environmental studies and so on. So interestingly, about 30 years ago, I would say when I first started my women's studies degree is when I started thinking about some of these issues around inclusivity. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an expert, but I guess perhaps I've been thinking about it for a while. And so I thought it would be a good idea to perhaps talk a little bit with you about it. And I will also say that this is fairly interactive. So I will be asking some questions pretty early on, and there's basically a workshop component to this as well as a short video that may be disturbing, and you'll see why. I joke, but it is kind of disturbing in a twisted kind of interesting way. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. All right, my sharing is working. Now, I actually probably am going to leave this in this mode because I believe I will not be able to see my notes if I move to presentation mode. Does that sound right, Neil, with Zoom? Yeah, I don't use Zoom as often, so. All right, so this is EDID in Teaching and Learning, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Disability. Some people have started using D over the last couple of years, the second D to include disability. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, one interesting thing, and you may recall, folks at Mount A, that just this summer, we actually had an email from our president about EDID, indicating that they had partnered, the administration had partnered with the became an employer partner of Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, which is a national charity. Now, the email mentioned some training sessions at Mount A that were going to be coming up for EDI, and they didn't include the second D. And it's becoming quite common in the corporate world to do these EDID training sessions. And now why am I doing air quotes around training is because I don't know that we should be doing training, but in fact, perhaps education would be a better word. And why do I think education might be a better word than training? Well, training doesn't usually include reflection or any kind of evaluation. And even if that's self-reflection and self-evaluation, right? And so I think those are the kinds of things that we may want to encourage. I remember many years ago working for an organization where we were developing standards and specifications to share educational resources. And there was one, well, actually it was it was the US military who was also involved in that, much to my chagrin. And they were very interested in training. And I kept saying that we are not doing training and we are not doing what you're asking us to do. They were very irritated with me. Luckily, I was the chair of the working groups and they couldn't tell me otherwise. I was like, get out of here. Anyhow, I digress a little bit, but that is a personal experience of the difference for me between training and education. We can train a dog to do tricks, but does that mean they really sort of understand what they're doing? All right, that sounded a little dark there. All right. Well, let's think about some definitions when it comes to issues like equality and diversity, inclusion, and so on, just so we're all kind of on the same page. So equity is the fair and respectful treatment of all people. And equity can kind of be considered the process, while equality is the result. And so there is a little bit of a difference. And this is partially why you see the graphic behind you here. So on the top, in terms of equality, everyone gets the same bicycle, right? Whether you're tall or short or use a wheelchair or what have you, it doesn't matter. Everyone is equally treated. But equity down below, we see that folks get bikes that are more appropriate for their size or abilities, right? And so someone can get a small bike, someone can get a bike that's controlled with their hands, and some can get a medium-sized bike. So you see the difference, I think, between equality and equity. So you often hear the narrative is often around equality, when in fact, we may want to be talking more about equity. Now, diversity is the demographic mix of the community or communities with a focus on representation of equity-deserving groups. Interestingly, Naomi Sheehan started writing about objectivity 30, 40 years ago now. She's a feminist epistemologist who's really interesting and tried to recoup this notion of objectivity by saying, you know what we need to have true objectivity is to have representation from all kinds of diverse groups. You gather those together, and that's objectivity. Now, I questioned whether we should really be calling it objectivity, but that's what Naomi Sheehan suggests that we should do. And it's an interesting approach. Now, inclusion is the creation of an environment where everyone feels welcome, is treated with respect, and is able to fully participate. And finally, disability. There's some interesting things in sociology when it comes to disability. Disability is the way, as a society, we produce barriers to certain people based on physical or intellectual, quote unquote, differences. This is in contrast to the medical model. That's why I mentioned this is interesting in sociology. And it's embodied in this notion of disabled person versus person with a disability. Now, some have argued, not even that long ago, that we should use person with a disability because it puts the person first. But it is based on a medical model. It is a person with a disability. And disabled person, though, points to the social processes by which someone is disabled, or sometimes I use the word disenabled as a way to try and point to that. And I'll even write it as dis/enabled to also point to the binary around disability and ability. So that's kind of how we understand disability in Soc, as someone who is disabled by social processes. And that can also be construction, right? We know that one probably most explicitly, right? Barriers to getting into a building, barriers to curbs on the roadside, and that sort of thing. But there are many ways in which you can be disabled by physical structures, but also by social structures, right? Okay, so I just wanted to make sure we were kind of on the same wavelength here. Well, here's where I'm going to start asking you questions. Why do we need EDID? Why is equity, diversity, and inclusion important? Why do we want to talk about disability? So I'm opening it up for you to add your comments. So what do you think? Put up your hand, shout out, do whatever you need to do. Why do we need EDID? I'm going to try and look at the chat. Oh, Carrie says your dog knows what they're doing. Excellent. Oh, Juan Carlos, great. Human rights. So you can do it via chat, or you can do it. I'm going to move the chat so I can see it a little bit better. Human rights, absolutely. Carla is mentioning equal opportunity. Greg, all voices, perspectives can be heard. Emily, justice, absolutely. Oh gosh, hard for me to keep up. I'm just going to scroll on back up. Human rights, humans, it's the right. As humans, it's the right. Bill mentioned. Emily, to get to acceptance in society, not just tolerance. Yeah, I don't like the word tolerance. It just means like, I'm tolerating someone, I'll put up with them, but I'm not really interested in more than that. Bill says it's also the thing to do. So that kind of starts wrapping back up into justice. Denise, learning for all, absolutely. So we're starting to slip into UDL kinds of things. Universal design perhaps is coming up here. Donna, a bit more selfishly for different perspectives in the classroom, and that enriches discussion, absolutely does. And often, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this, I've experienced this myself, when someone says, hey, this is a problem for me, this is a barrier for me, and I wasn't necessarily aware of it, right? And then, you know, you're also learning from that point of view of, oh, right, I'm not doing this thing in such a way that makes it accessible. And just having those diverse, just like Naomi Sheeman, having those diverse perspectives enriches the discussion, absolutely. Ashley is saying, make sure that decisions are being made that include all humans, not just those that are sitting at the decision-making table. Andrew, as an instructor, oh gosh, we have a vested interest in justice, rights, and those things, but we also want effective learning. Yeah, absolutely. Emma is saying it's good for sensitizing us to different abled people's challenges and addressing it directly, achieve real progress. I'm also hearing accessibility in place of disability. Erin has mentioned EDIA. Yeah, absolutely. I've also seen EDIDA actually. So I've seen that as well. Solutions, so Neil is saying, oh, Neil, solutions you find in addressing EDID ends up benefiting all students. Absolutely does. And for those of us who I mentioned earlier, and this was in the 90s when I was working on this, ways to share content across platforms and across the internet, across the web, quite honestly, that was one of the things that we stressed. So I was also working for an accessibility group at that time. I was the co-chair of an accessibility group that fed specifications into the IEEE, which is an international engineering organization. And that is exactly what we would always say, is that this is not just for folks who are disabled by a social system or physical structures or what have you. This is about everyone, quite frankly. So yeah, absolutely, great point. And Lynn, so we can give up on the ideal imagined learner, the quote, parenthetically, dominant group that all public education was designed for. Yeah, absolutely. So that we don't have this cookie cutter approach of one size fits all for everyone, because it doesn't work for everyone. It may not even work for those people in the dominant group, right? It's an interesting thing that you say that, Lynn. One of the things I often say is that for me, education has worked out quite well because I was able to, it worked for me. I was able to leverage it. And as someone who grew up working class, working poor, I was quite happy about that because of the opportunities it afforded me and then others in my family. But I also recognized that it was only because I fit in there, right? I was able to make it work for me. And so I was very privileged in that respect. So absolutely. Good. Excellent. Well, I don't know whether we want to talk about this, but we're going to talk about bias a little bit. So I'm not a psychologist. I do teach psych a bit, actually, but nonetheless, it is not my forte. But there's some really interesting things that come out of psych. And one of the things has to do with bias and how we understand bias. I don't know about the rest of you, but even with my students, I will say, well, is bias the right word? But I don't really know what other word to use, to be perfectly honest with you, because it carries with it negative connotations. Oh, you're biased, and so you're dismissed. Uh, and sometimes I always say, well, maybe it's your position, it's your standpoint, it's your perspective. But let's talk about it from a psych point of view, like what is bias? Well, bias in psych is basically the ways in which we quickly and inaccurately evaluate people. It's flat, it's just shallow understanding of people. It's considered kind of the shorthand, quick way of responding to all the info that's coming at us. That's at least what the discipline of psychology says. What we end up doing through this, and there's some really interesting research on this, we give some people more value and advantage and others less value or disadvantage when we evaluate them based on our biases in these kinds of ways. So that includes things like, and this is where we start getting into social psych and to sociology, things like sexism, rainbowphobia, racism, ableism, things like level of education, religion often, SES, and even Lookism. For those people, some people may be familiar with some of the research that's been done on how people who meet a certain beauty ideal are evaluated more positively. And you think, okay, well, they're just evaluated more positively. People just think they're pretty. They think they're handsome. They think they're attractive. Well, it's not just that, though. What happens is they end up making more money. They end up having more social currency. They end up being listened to more. So there are some really significant impacts of the kinds of evaluations. Oh, SES, socioeconomic status. Sorry, Neil. See, I'm using my, I'm being bad. I'm using my SOC acronyms. I apologize. So yeah, so in psych, it's assumed that we carry with us and we do these kinds of evaluations based on our biases. I want to also mention something else that I have found extremely helpful in many of my classes, and that has to do with what's considered alpha and beta bias. And it really helps me when I'm talking to students about how, for example, within my classes, like my gender relations class, my sex and sexuality class, that alpha bias is used to exaggerate difference. And in gender and sex work, I mean, research on sex and research on gender, that in fact, difference is what gets funded, difference is what gets published, difference is what people listen to. They don't want to hear about how everyone is the same. You put in an NSERC grant or a SHRC grant and you want to demonstrate the sameness between, say, across gender, across sex, across sexualities. No one cares. It doesn't get funded. It doesn't get published. You're not going to read it in the New Yorker. Well, maybe New Yorker is a bad example, but you're not going to read it in most newspapers or CBC or what have you. What you're going to read about and hear about are differences. And so I find that that's really helpful in understanding bias, especially when we know there are exaggerated differences, but also sometimes exaggerated sameness. That comes a lot out of certain areas around sort of humanism, for example. In humanism, there's a lot of exaggerated sameness sometimes, but exaggerated difference is what we see much more than exaggerated sameness. One of the fun things I do as well in my classes sometimes, particularly in my sex and sexuality class, we talk about the opposite sex. And I say, well, actually, that's a fairly new phenomenon, the notion of opposite sex. But beyond that, I also say, and how are we opposite? I say, am I not more opposite to a rock? That makes more sense to me. Because, you know, I can look around the classroom and say, well, we're all, you know, we have a lot of similarities. Most of us will have 2 eyes and a nose and a couple of ears, maybe in a mouth and maybe some hair, sometimes lessening. We have a lot more in common than we have not. And opposite is, you know, the very narrative, the discourse suggests that we are absolutely different. And we're not so absolutely different. I'm much more different to a rock. Doesn't have any arms, doesn't have any legs, doesn't have a brain, doesn't have any eyes or ears. Like that to me makes a little bit more sense. So the thing is, we all have bias, if we want to use that word. So is it bad? Is it bias or is it perspective? So I've got to pause here for asking what you think. So what do you think? Do we all have bias and is it bad? You can, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I was going to say just about lookism too. Studies done in the United States show that in fact the way a person looks has effects on whether juries convict them, right? And it certainly plays into issues of racialization and those kinds of matters as well. But I mean, one of the most bizarre ones, and I'd have to look for the study now, showed that hair color had an effect on fundraising.
Well, that's a new one for me.
Yeah, that for example, blondes raised more money than brunettes, right? So those, you know, it's a fairly sort of pervasive kind of thing. I have always thought that perspective is really important. And part of that, my own background is as a historian, and once upon a time, people wrote history as a story of prime ministers and kings and things like that, which focused on a very specific demographic group. And it required somebody saying, hey, I don't see myself in this history. And starting to say, you know, where are the women? Where are the workers? Where are, you know, people of color or immigrants in the Canadian experience? Where are Indigenous people? So those were, you know, if those were biases, they were used to good effect by historians to start to say, hey, we can look at the national narrative in a very different way. And why, you know, I don't want to steal, I'll be quiet after in a second, but you know, if people have not read, say, Sylvia Van Kirk's book, Many Tender Ties, it's a fascinating book about the character and nature of the expansion of the fur trade, which completely overturns a male-centric narrative of the movement of settler society westward in Canada.
A fun fact, Andrew, I read that book about 30 years ago in a history class I did in history and women in the fur trade. I told you I had to have a weird educational background.
Weird background. We read it as a critique of Staples theory.
Oh,
right?
okay,
So, right, which was a male-centric narrative, you know, hardy voyageurs and things like that.
So thanks very much, Andrew. I see that Heather saying bias is necessary for us to function. And yes, and I have read that in as well in psych. Often they say, well, this is how we move through the world. It's how our brains work. The types of biases we are talking about here is an unfortunate outcome which we can work on dismantling with training. Just kidding, haha, education. So thanks, Heather. Uh, Neil is mentioning, I think there's real danger in imagining that one doesn't have any bias. We're going to see some of that shortly in this video I mentioned. I mentioned it was a bit disturbing, and that's because it includes Donald Trump. But anyhow, we definitely all have biases, perspectives. Emily says, I don't think it's bad in and of itself, but I can think sometimes we use it in a negative way. Absolutely. So you can recognize, I've said this for a long, long time, we can recognize difference, right? And you could call that bias, you could call it whatever you want. But what happens, I think the problem, and feminists have been, feminist epistemologists in particular, and ontologists and others have been addressing this for decades now, is it's then in the evaluation, right? So I can recognize that there's a difference between Neil and I. Neil has a hat and I do not have a hat. But do I then say, oh, Neil, he's a this or that because look, he wears hats. That's, I'm using a particularly silly example with purpose, but absolutely. Donna is mentioning my students come in thinking bias is bad and they don't have any, so I use perspective. So yeah, it has that negative connotation, doesn't it? And Andrew's saying that they're scared now. And Neil saying the same experience of students, that they don't think they have any biases. Yeah, it's a hard one too, right? Because I don't want to, and Carla's mentioning stereotypes and biases make our lives, they do make our lives easier, which is what Carla's mentioned, because we can navigate through the world easier. But then the question becomes, should we make it that easy on ourselves, right? We need to sort of be reflective, hence why I don't like the training bit so much. I like the education bit. We need to be self-aware and reflective and even evaluative, right? All right, I think I might be going a little long. Hopefully I'm not. We need to interrogate all the processes of discernment, reasoning, conclusion making, and judgment, perspective, and viewpoints. Lynn writes. Don is also saying, I think it's pretty common at Neil with regards to students thinking they don't have any biases. And you're absolutely right. Getting back to, who was it who mentioned they used the word perspective, which is sometimes why I will use that as well, or say standpoint, borrowing from Smith's idea of standpoint epistemology. So yeah, I try to sometimes be a little bit careful about that word. Juan Carlos is saying, I tell the students that bias can be problematic if you have to react quickly, for instance, police, healthcare. Yeah, it certainly can be. I'm not particularly, let's say, I'm not trusting, let's say, of the police necessarily. I don't necessarily see them as, and so, I've gotten into a little bit of trouble where I've not, been very, kind, let's say, to the police officers. I've always been in the right, so it's not really been a problem, but I digress a little bit. Greg is writing, speaking of bias, it's ironic in an education session on EDID that Toni pokes fun at Donald Trump. What if I'm a Trump supporter? I'm not. Is that a safe space for a Trump supporter? Well, because, so here's where it comes into play, right? Is like, how do we address difference? How do we address perspective? How do we, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that all perspectives are valid. To me, some people will totally disagree with me. I'm not a liberal individualist. So that's why I would say, yeah, some hateful perspectives like, neo-Nazism, not really for me. I'm not going to give that the same weight in terms of value as I would, Neil, or I would others in this group, right? Or so on. So you're right. Someone who's a Trump supporter might not feel necessarily that they might be able to come forward here. I would hope that they would, but they might not. And I would just say, use the critical thinking, use the reflective. We were talking about reflection in education, self-awareness, evaluation, and so on. So yeah, don't misunderstand liberal individualism for EDIDA, right? Or EDIAD, depending on where you put the D or A first. So that's a bit different, okay? And if you want to have another discussion at some point about liberal individualism, we absolutely can. All right. And I'm glad, Greg, you're not a Trump supporter. I did a whole course called Trump in Society, by the way, a couple of years ago. We haven't repeated it, and maybe we won't have to. All right. There also, Lynn is saying, yes, Tony, good to name what can be supported in an equitable and safe learning space, like liberal individualism reference. All right, so how do we form biases? Again, I'm drawing here on psych, and there's maybe some folks here who know a bit more about this than I do, but we do draw from our experience, often confirmation bias, and there's also the primacy effect. So confirmation bias is basically when you are attentive to those things that confirm your biases. So you hear something in the media, you go, oh yeah, I believe that. And then you hear 7 other things, you don't really pay any attention to them, but you hear another thing, you go, oh yeah, I believe in that. And so you're constantly confirming your bias through exposure or talking to other people who confirm your bias, right? It's one of the things that's been coming up in Facebook, right? I teach a digital sociology class. And right, we know now increasingly how Google and Facebook and other not just search engines, but social media websites, Twitter, and so on, that they actually enforce and reinforce biases because of the exposures, right? You expose yourself to similar ideologies repeatedly and consistently, and then the algorithms pick up on that and show you increasingly things that support your viewpoint, or in fact, there's some research that suggests they actually radicalize you as well. So this is the sort of stuff that can certainly happen. The primacy effect is basically simple. It's like you hear something first and that's what you believe because you heard it first. So even if you, there's lots of data or information or research that suggests what the first thing that you heard, like I heard that dogs are all evil, as an example. I just continue to believe that that's the first thing I've encountered in terms of my experience of dogs. And so this is what I believe. And even though I have heard from many others, and I see lots of research that tells me that dogs aren't evil, because I heard it first, it kind of resides, it resonates, let's say. Resonate's the word I sometimes use to explain that. But again, there are probably folks here on this, who are involved here at this workshop webinar who know more about it than I do. All right, what else do we have? I mentioned already what others tell us, how we form biases. Media is increasingly a huge one as well. Increasingly, by the way, so I also teach a socialization class. It's off the books now, but I did for many, many years. And interesting thing about media is that once you hit about, in the West, once you hit about 11 years old, 10, 11, 12, there are 2 major socializers, your peers, your friends, and the media. And so your siblings, your guardians, your parents, and what have you, become secondary to the media and to your friends, basically, in terms of their influence on you. Institutions, of course, religious, educational, political. This is an educational institution right here. And through all of this, we developed those mental maps that some of you suggested that we kind of need in many ways to sort of move through the world and function in the world, and apply them to those we meet based on these. But as already been noted, the problem is we think we're being neutral. We think we're being fair and objective, when in fact, we may not be. And so here's my example. As I've written here, buckle up. So here's the next slide, and let's hope that this works properly.
Yeah, We're going to continue on the issue of race. Mr. President,
believe
you've
that one.
described the Black Lives Matter movement as a symbol of hate. You've shared a video of a man chanting white power to millions of your supporters. You've said that Black professional athletes exercising their First Amendment rights should be fired. What do you say to Americans who say that kind of language from a president is contributing to a climate of hate and racial strife?
Well, you have to understand, the first time I ever heard of Black Lives Matter, they were chanting pigs in a blanket, talking about police. Pigs, talking about our police. Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon. I said, that's a horrible thing. And they were marching down the street. And that was my first glimpse of Black Lives Matter. I thought it was a terrible thing. As far as my relationships with all people, I think I have great relationships with all people. I am the least racist person in this room.
Well, what do you say to Americans who are concerned by that rhetoric?
I don't know.
and by
I mean, I
the
don't know what to
videos?
say. I got criminal justice reform done and prison reform and opportunity zones. I took care of Black colleges and universities. I don't know what to say. They can say anything. I mean, they can say anything. It makes me sad because I am the least racist person. I can't even see the audience because it's so dark, but I don't care who's in the audience. I'm the least racist person in this room.
Okay, Vice President Biden, let me ask you very quickly, and then I have a follow-up question for you.
Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. He pours fuel on every single racist fire, every single one. Started off his campaign coming down the escalator saying he's going to get rid of those Mexican rapists. He's banned Muslims because they're Muslims.
All righty then. So this was the example to demonstrate exactly what we've already been talking about, this idea that if you're not self-aware, if you believe that your biases don't exist, if you think you're being neutral and objective, this is kind of what you end up with, right? There's a disconnect. Linda's saying more Trump than I've ever watched. I'm sorry to subject you to that. I apologize. But it's interesting to see that, right? This is exactly the sort of thing we're talking about, where we've got Biden on one hand saying that Donald Trump is not the least racist person in the room, and Donald Trump saying, I've done all these wonderful things, and I don't understand when people call me a racist. Now, I'm cognizant of the time. I don't know if there's more that you want to say about that, but that was my way of trying to demonstrate this idea that you all seem to, have, or many of you, I should say, have experienced in your, with some of your students. And of course, we have to apply it to ourselves too, right? So again, as some of you mentioned in the chat, like, okay, we can have these biases. So what do we do with that? Well, I've already alluded to some of these things. We need to be reflective and practice inclusive behavior, right? We need to listen to diverse groups, including ourselves sometimes, right? We are also part of those diverse groups. I mentioned earlier that I come from a working class, working poor family, and it really was working poor. I have Indigenous uncles and aunts and cousins. I'm also, my sexuality is non-conforming. And so, there are lots of things that I think I also come to the table with as well. I think it's important for us to try at least to understand our biases, that they exist and how they came to be. So part of it is sort of thinking about, okay, again, that reflective component, which is not in the training necessarily. Think about structural issues, institutional issues, right? So how do sexist structures, for example, how do ableist structures perpetuate and inform us, right? Discuss and talk to people who are socially different from yourself. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, I suppose, but nonetheless, it's an interesting thing to know. And by the way, did you know that same-sex partners are often more different from one another than other sex partners in terms of race and class and religion and age and so on? So it's just a sort of interesting side note. I've already talked about education and training. And last year, we did a book in the book club called So You Want to Talk About Race, which is obviously about addressing some of these issues. And we're doing Baptiste's book right now for the fall, the Decolonizing Education book. And so, those are some of the things that we can certainly participate in. Being accountable. But I'm mentioning here, call people into the conversation. Some of you have heard me say this, rather than calling them out, right? So rather than finger pointing and saying you're a bad person, even though sometimes we may want to do that, it might be more productive. This is just a suggestion of calling them into the conversation, asking them about it. So I'm going to give you a personal example that has been coming up lately with my family. I'm going to give you a family example of my 31-year-old nephew who refuses to be vaccinated. And I've said to him, explain to me, can you tell me about why you don't want to be vaccinated? What's going on there? And trying to have conversations with him about the idea of like what his concerns might be. And his concerns are he thinks he gets the shot, he's going to get sick. And that's his major concern. And Lynn, you're posting Tufts University interrupting bias, calling out versus calling in. Excellent, good stuff. I'll take a look at that later. Self-accountability, but be careful of guilt. Many have noted that guilt is not a really good motivator necessarily. And no, I'm not recommending this, but I just think this is interesting that you can find these kinds of things. There's a test from Harvard called the Project Implicit, but it's very problematic, to be perfectly honest with you. But this test from Harvard is supposed to indicate whether you have any bias or not. All right. I think I only have, in fact, I think I'm kind of a little bit over because I wanted more time for discussion, but I wanted to talk about these things. I've got this is drawn from futurelearn.com, actually, the comfortable diversity wheel. And I like this idea. So this is a reflective component, let's say. I want you to look at the wheel. We've got different components on the comfort diversity wheel. We've got family, political belief, we've got education, we've got age, race, ethnicity, mental, physical ability, sexual, I don't like orientation, we won't get into the reason, but sexuality, let's say, national origin, gender, organizational role, language, communication skills, income, religion, appearance, work experience, education. So think about this comfortable diversity wheel and reflect on specific types of diversity that is very comfortable for you. And you can even list a few reasons. You can do this on your own, or you can share here why this type of difference is maybe not difficult for you. So I'm going to probably say for myself, sexuality, right? Because my sexuality is non-conforming. I think I'm fairly aware of diverse sexualities, and that actually also includes gender expressions in my particular case. And my background in women's studies. And by the way, and the reason I keep saying women's studies and not women and gender studies is it's a degree in women's studies. It was 30 years ago. This was before the name changed. And so that's what it was. So I think I'm pretty good there when it comes to those kinds of things. And that's probably why, right? So personal experience and maybe education is part of that. So does anyone else want to share? You can just shout out, you can put it in the chat, but it would be nice to hear another voice if someone is comfortable. Like, what ones do you feel comfortable with? And why? Greg kind of mentioned political belief, and maybe I'm not so good at that one.
Can I clarify, Toni, is this the kinds of diversity that we feel comfortable engaging with others around? Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you're comfortable with people who have diverse ages, like young and old. And why would that be? Is it because you have a family that includes lots of young people and maybe grandchildren and older people? You know, is it education? So Carl's saying we're comfortable with different religions, probably because of exposure. Friends who are atheists and a friend who is a reverend. Yeah. Andrew, I will confess, I struggle with political belief, not all of them, but some cause me pause. So we're kind of, I set you up there, Andrew, because the next one is the uncomfortable diversity wheel. So, so you're getting it. You know, I took you down the garden path to get a little bit ahead, but yeah, I struggled with that one myself. Juan Carlos, language, communication. Love to hear people with foreign accents. Absolutely. Neil, I feel comfortable working with folks across the gender spectrum, as I've had long experience with many kind of gender expressions, probably work related to somewhat, Neil. Lynn says, as a recovering Catholic, I work hard in the religion conversation. Yeah. So that is a hard one for me, I should say. I mean, I'm pretty decent with religion as an area of study for me, Donna says. Yeah. Anyone else before we get to the uncomfortable wheel? We're kind of slipping into the uncomfortable wheel, and that's good. All right, let's go to the uncomfortable diversity wheel. And you can see there's really no, there's hardly any change to the slide. Same thing. Greg's writing, I see struggles everywhere for me, but that's great, right? That's about being aware and reflective about that sort of thing. So where might you, so some of us have already said where we might have some struggles. Political beliefs might be one for me. I'm not a big fan of people like Donald Trump, but that's because, can I say that he's a racist, sexist asshole? I think I can. So, you know, I have a problem with that because basically I view Trump as rather intolerant, to say the least. Everything else, I kid, I struggle about language and communication and probably political belief. And Lynn is saying yes, exclamation point. I think that may have been about the racist, sexist comment I made. I discovered something fun in Teams the other day during a class. I swore in class, but it was appropriate. I said bastard, and I had live captioning on. And this is interesting. So the live captioning did not record bastard. It put a series of asterisks in because I was swearing. So that was interesting. So they were intolerant of my language, let's say, in some interesting way. Yeah, I actually have an interesting struggle with religion as well, although several of my dear friends are religious. Two of my dear friends are religious studies profs. They're some of my closest friends. That sounds terrible to say it that way, but like some of my best friends are. But I do struggle around the religion one sometimes because I identify as an anti-theist. So I see religion as being problematic. So I definitely struggle around that one. Neil saying I have some discomfort in conversations around race. I really worry about being unintentionally causing harm. Yeah, I hear you on that one too. Mariah, I struggle around political belief, but I feel like this is a relatively new issue that I struggle with since Donald Trump. Yeah. It was interesting, you know why I offered the course, the Donald Trump course, the Trump and Society course. So many students were saying, oh my gosh, I just went home for the holidays and my uncle so-and-so or my aunt so-and-so or my cousin this or that were saying how much they supported Trump. These were Canadians and Americans and others across the globe, and said, like, how do we respond to that? Like, what do we do? How do we? And so that was why I delivered the course Trump and Society. Because others were struggling in many ways as well. Emma, this is also against access because those using the captions to understand were considered not needing of all language you choose to use. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I struggle around work experience, appearance, and family conversations. Okay. Donna, true story, Emma, it is a problem. Absolutely. Yeah. So the students, in fact, there are students in my classes who have hearing loss, and they didn't know what I was saying. And there was no way that I could really, I mean, I guess I could have typed it in the chat, but there was no way of them knowing what I was actually saying. Chiming in, finally, Alex mentions political belief and religion for me. Lynn, uncategorized, more nuanced conversations of diversity are challenging to negotiate. Yeah, absolutely. These categories for many of us in Soc cause us trouble too, right? Like race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, etc. We go, these are kind of dodgy social categories that many of us are also trying to simultaneously deconstruct. And so it does become difficult in many ways. All right, I feel like I've talked too much, even though I know I was pulling from the chat. Oh, Emily, for those who don't know this, critical adult educator Stephen Brookfield has done quite a bit of practice-based research over the decades on reflexive anti-racist work white educators can do. Some publications here. Excellent. Thank you, Emily. I've got just this one last slide asking you what we can do. So what can we do in our classrooms? What can we do with regards to students, with regards to faculty, with regards to staff, and so on? What can we do? Or general comments. So this was I realize this is a basic introduction. It was meant to be, but I hope it seemed to have sparked some good chat, some good conversation. What do you think we can do? Or just comments that you might have about EDIDA or biases or so on. So I will leave it for conversation. What do you think? Bye, Corinne. Corinne is stepping out. I know many of you have a meeting in just 5 minutes. Oh, Greg saying, can you recommend certain features to exclude from syllabi? So you can include some things from our mean center, and other universities would have similar centers. So those are centers for students. So disabled students or students with disabilities is often the language you hear from the mean centers and from others like that. Again, sociologically, we would say disabled peoples. Anyhow, so they often have statements you can add. I add a statement basically saying if you have any, it's basically if you want to come talk to me about any difference across, I even say things like culture, language, sexuality, so on, come talk to me and we will talk those through. So you might think, well, sexuality, what does that have to do with things? Well, in the research, it's quite clear that if you are non-conforming in terms of your sexuality, you would kind of more stress, more depression, you're more likely to be unemployed, you're more likely to have lower income, and these things affect your ability to work, right? I mean, do your studies work. And so that might be an important thing. You know, it might be someone saying, well, I'm dealing with some personal issues with regards to my sexuality, and and so can you be particularly accommodating, let's say, I don't like the word, when it comes to due dates and things like that? Or can we talk about being more inclusive in language? Or, someone who wants to use different pronouns. So you may have noticed my pronouns are he, she, they, because I'm, trying to disrupt the notion of gender. So, like maybe it's someone who says, I want he and I don't want they, or whatever it happens to be. So that's the thing. It's sort of a general welcoming that I put on my course outlines, but I should also stress, I also make sure I say it in class, whether it be online or otherwise. So it's one thing to put it on your course outlines. That's a terrific idea, but it has more weight or additional weight, let's say, when you actually say it in person, whether it be, again, on Teams or Zoom or face-to-face or what have you. Yeah. Donna said, one of the best things I think you can do for EDID is offer choice of assignments, due dates, etc. Give students more agency. Absolutely. And that again starts to align with universal design for learning. You're absolutely right. Sandy, my attempted solution, reflection, and then meta reflection. Absolutely. Good point. Ashley, we encourage our equity officer on campus to help redevelop our syllabi in the business school at Acada, which was helpful. Oh, good. There you go. Fantastic. Lynn's got to go. Goodbye, Lynn. Oh yeah, I remember meeting you at Acada when I invited Gail Dines to class. Great perspectives. Yes, that was a really interesting. I'll tell you all about it someday if you're interested in the Gail Dines conversation. All right. Some people, other people having to run. Thank you so much. I find it really helpful to lay out for students the ways of addressing my shortcomings, Neil writes. I invite them to talk to me, but I encourage them to reach out to my boss if they don't feel comfortable, or their boss, and I include email addresses. Good, that's a good one. Be an open instructor with a safe, open atmosphere, Bill writes. Absolutely. In fact, I also mentioned that in my course outlines, that you should feel safe, you should feel comfortable. And I also say it first class when we go through, like, what I basically go through what are the terms of engagement for the class and what student responsibilities are and so on. And that includes this idea of safety. Now, I do say you may be uncomfortable at times, there can be discomfort, but that doesn't mean that's different than you know, some of these being open and safe and what have you. So you should be feeling safe, but you may also feel some discomfort, right? Like watching a Trump video could cause some discomfort. It really could. I think it's incredibly important to consult those in the given situation, Emma writes, while not falling back on them for all teaching when it's available elsewhere, but just asking can spark a very open discussion. Absolutely. Juan Carlos is saying, talk about it in class. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really direct way of doing it. It shows that it's important to you and you value it. Neil, I tell my students that I don't want to assume that it's a safe space, but that I hope to make it as safe for them as I can. Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about it as a process as well, right? And so that I hope it's a safe space. I want it to be a safe space. So I want to do what I can do. And I hope the students will be part of that equation and making it a safe space. It comes with trust sometimes, right? And that you don't get that immediately in the first class. It takes a little time. Emily, I consult pronunciation guidelines in advance of class if I ensured her to avoid apologizing after the fact. I do the same thing, actually. I'm like, how do I say that name? And I still sometimes get them wrong, but I try. And yeah, Neil saying, we need to wrap it up. Absolutely, we're at 1 o'clock. Ashley just says, I'll just say this last thing. I want them to record video instructions with their proper pronunciation and pronoun, anything I should know about them. Oh, excellent idea. Maybe we'll have a session one day on pronouns. Okay, I'm gonna mute my mic now.
Thank you so much, Toni. This has been terrific. And we'll leave the call open perhaps after we finish the session properly, but we do like to finish by just turning our cameras on and maybe having a wave if you're comfortable, acknowledging that we're being recorded, no worries. But it's nice to remind her that there really are people behind all of these little boxes. Thank you so much for turning up, everyone. What a terrific engagement we've had from you. Thank you for your bravery.
Hi.